Well, thank you everyone for joining us. As you just heard, this meeting is being recorded and we're going to be posting this on the internet. Exactly where that will be is to be determined. So just know that that's how we'll be doing this going forward. So I'm going to set the stage a little bit about what this is and what we're doing here, and then we'll dive in and give Pathways the main portion of the talking. So in 2017, Oregon created the Ocean Acidification Hypoxia Council, what we call the OAH Council. And it's got folks from industry, tribal representative, academia, state agency leaders. And we get together, and things we've done are come up with biennial reports to legislature, kind of updating what we're doing. We've created an action plan of where things are going. Also, in 2022, the Oregon Ocean Science Trust, what we call OOST in Oregon, consulted with the OAH Council and kind of looked for proposals or projects that they could do to promote ocean acidification and hypoxia research in Oregon. That was taken to the legislature and created House Bill 3114. Many of the scientists who are on here are people who are funded their research. It looked at a number of different things. But one of the things that the OAH Council really deemed as something we needed was a way to better communicate the type of research and work that we're doing. And where this contract went out. Pathways Collaborative was hired to do the work by the OAH Council, and was also working with our education and outreach working group that we have. The goal was to develop a communications toolkit and an implementation strategy for that toolkit so we can do a better job with our outreach and education. And so that's what we're going to hear about today, is a little bit about that communication toolkit, and then tomorrow we'll hear about the implementation plan of that. So Nancy and Nettie, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Leaf. And I want to thank Leaf and Jenny, who's on the call, and more recently, Caitlin, who has joined the team in helping really get these final deliverables to all of you. My name is Nettie Pletcher. I'm zooming in from San Diego today to present part one, as Leaf mentioned, of this OAH communication plan. Part one is what we refer to as the communication toolkit. Part two is an implementation plan, which Nancy Hotchkiss will be presenting tomorrow, same time, same place. Hope to see some of you there as well. As I'm going through today, each of the sections of the communication toolkit, we ask that you please feel free to add any questions or comments you may have in the chat. Nancy's going to be monitoring that chat box. And as I go through each section, I'll pause a few times throughout, and if anything has come up in that period, Nancy will flag it for me and we can dive a little deeper on that. We've allotted 2 hours for this great show. We may not take the full time. It depends in part on how quickly I talk and the number and types of questions we have throughout. So without further ado, I will get us going here. So the messaging toolkit is just one component of a larger coordinated messaging plan. The OAH Council also produces legislative reports on OAH for the governor. These come out every 2 years. Some of you are intimately involved with those. And since 2017, the OAH Council has been implementing the legislature's vision to provide these science-based recommendations to the state, talking about how to understand, how to adapt, communicate about, and really strengthen Oregon's response to changing ocean conditions, the negative impacts that's having on a lot of lives in Oregon. In even-numbered years, the council produces this biennial report to the legislature that provides an update kind of on Oregon's implementation of the Oregon OAH action plan. And those reports share kind of the status of things. They capture some stories, talk about progress being made around mitigation and ocean change resilience efforts. So that's a really important piece. And then this communications toolkit that we're looking at today pairs with that nicely. It lays out specific actions around sort of public outreach, looking at audience-specific messages that, when paired with the legislative report, make up a coordinated messaging plan about OAH in a way that helps advance this understanding of ocean change, generate support for OAH mitigation, as well as highlights actions for different groups that lead to civic action. And then the final component that we're getting into in the next session, the implementation plan, supports all of that work. So the full communication plan, as Leif mentioned, it will be available on the OOST website, along with recordings of this presentation and tomorrow's presentation. And it may also potentially go up on ODFW's website. I had put in the chat a link to the final product document. Maybe somebody who is here can copy that and make it available again to people who joined a little bit later in the chat. But that's what the cover of the final product looks like. And it's divided into two parts. Part one, I mentioned, is this communication toolkit, which presents effective messages for communicating about OAH that inspire support for policies to help mitigate it. And this part of the plan includes OAH messages that are tailored for really specific audiences, those audiences being ones who are really well positioned, we felt, to take civic action. So for most of the rest of this period, I'm going to be focusing on part one, the communication toolkit contents, but as a little teaser, as a preview, part two presents this implementation plan for operationalizing the communication toolkit that I'm talking about. And that part, the implementation plan, offers sort of step-by-step instructions for implementing the ideas described in this toolkit. It will include who is responsible for enacting it, a suggested timeline, and also how to evaluate success of the project. So again, tomorrow's presentation, led by Nancy, will focus on the implementation plan and provide a model of essentially how to utilize what we're talking about today. The main components of the communication toolkit part are prioritization of audiences, kind of who did we focus on and why. The messages, so really explaining how we got to specific messages for those audiences and what you might say when interacting with them. The civic actions to address OAH, moving from message to action. A little bit about how you might take this training over to your networks, and then a list of resources for additional reference. So as I said, I'll present each section. We'll pause periodically to take questions. Okay, so it's known that effective communication requires an understanding of the specific audience that you want to have receive your message. A particular message that you have may resonate really well with one group, but not with another. And just thinking about Oregonians broadly, that's going to be, it's not a specific enough audience. So when the OAH Council first considered which audiences to prioritize, we began by just getting some familiarity with what are all the varied demographics around the state to help us tailor our messaging for those distinct populations. So to understand the demographics of audiences in Oregon, we turned to a wonderful resource, the Yale Project on Climate Change Communications, and specifically their 6 Americas Spectrum. So while that project, the Climate Change Communications Project at Yale, addresses climate change writ large, it's a really useful tool and reference for those concerned with OAH, given that both ocean acidification and hypoxia are, of course, ocean-based effects of climate change. They're caused by changes in ocean chemistry, driven by the increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so just understanding how the general populace thinks and feels about climate change is a very reasonable starting point for determining what are their beliefs and attitudes related to OAH. Now, as part of their annual reporting, Yale and another university, George Mason, conduct this 6 Americas study. They've been tracking American attitudes around climate change since 2009 and have developed this spectrum on a scale of highest to sort of least concerned about climate change. You've got the alarmed at the top there. The 6 Americas represent the spectrum of beliefs, right? The different ways that people react to climate change as a concept. And this is looking at data from 2021 nationally. The Six Americas Project also runs a searchable interactive website that gives us access to data on lots of different factors across, starting with the national, but drilling down into state and even metro levels, different areas. So zooming in on just Oregon, you can see here some important trends for Oregonians as they relate to communication about climate science. This is showing us that the estimated percent of adults across the entire state who think about global warming, who think global warming is happening, so that belief, is 75%. That's compared to the national average of 72%. And specifically here, looking at the individual counties, you can note some really interesting, significant geographic variation in this belief. So specifically, we looked at residents in the Multnomah and Washington counties. Those are the really dark red shapes. They're much more likely, in fact, 80% or higher, than residents in, I guess, Gilliam and Morrow counties. Those are down at 55% belief that global warming is happening. Notably, for our purposes, the coastal counties, Lincoln and Lane, are at about 75%. We also looked at the percent of state residents who discuss global warming, at least occasionally. It's one thing to believe it's happening, but are they actually talking about it, expressing this belief openly in public, or at least with their families? And so again, based on data from 2021, we found 41% of Oregonians discuss global warming at least occasionally. This is 6 points higher than the national average. But on a county level, again, data showing variations in different geographic regions of the state. The highest percentage of residents who discuss global warming at least occasionally was 52% in Multnomah County. That's the yellow. And again, the Six Americas construct applies to climate change broadly, but it is a useful approximation here, we think, in understanding the citizens' beliefs about and tendencies to discuss the related concepts like OAH. And we know a lot of Oregon's economy directly impacted by climate change issues. We've got ocean acidification impacting seafood industry and forestry and agriculture. And so all of these data are really important in light of understanding that effective messaging can make that information more accessible and generate more public discussion of the topic. And we wanted to be able to really understand this, to be able to select a message for a specific audience that would increase their receptiveness to the conversation, to talking about climate-related issues like OAH, with the goal of subsequently shifting understanding of the threats that these issues have toward the Oregonians' environment and livelihoods, and really ultimately spurring them towards actions around solutions. So once we had a sense of these sort of overall demographics, the OAH Council needed to select, well, who should we focus on for maximum impact? And in order to narrow down the possible audiences to target, we followed a very systematic process. We started with this list. It's tiny writing on your screen because it was a long list. But this was the list generated by the OAH Council of the many possible audience segments. And with this, we developed a matrix that helped assess kind of the viability and the impact of each audience group. We looked at a lot of multiple demographic factors. We looked at psychographic factors, including we looked at geographic distribution across the state, the relative size of each audience within Oregon. We wanted to think through kind of the ease of reaching that audience with the group that we had available, and the weight that that audience carried in terms of being influencers, as well as where did they fall on the Six Americas scale of concern about climate change. And going through this exercise revealed certain audience segments as being stronger candidates for our OAH sort of communication campaign. So from the original list, which was over 45 possible audiences, we winnowed the options to 8 groups. I'll show you those in just a moment. Those 8 groups aligned most closely with the OAH Council's interests and showed the most promise we felt for having an impact. So here's that narrowed down list that was selected for further consideration. We thought about high school and college students, senior citizens, the tourism and hospitality industry, commercial fisheries and harvest industries, local government, really focusing in on port and county commissioners as a specific subset of that, city planners, outdoor rec enthusiasts, and seafood suppliers and restaurants. So we did a little bit of lumping, as you can see, to get it down to 8. And then to bring these sort of 8 population segments to life, we crafted audience profiles. Those took the form of short narratives describing fictional characters who represented that particular group. And the OAH Council provided feedback on those profiles to ensure that they sufficiently encapsulated sort of the spirit of the intended audience. And then we used those edited profiles in a broader survey to systematically go through and weigh various items related to that audience. So this approach helped the group, I think, avoid bias in selecting their final list of target audiences. Each audience got rated on the bulleted items on the left, so their ability to amplify the message, the number of barriers that might exist to connecting with them, importantly, the likelihood that they could effectively communicate with legislators, as well as the value of increasing their civic readiness, and then just our personal enthusiasm about connecting with them. And so survey respondents were asked to rank their top 3 from the list of 8, top 3 choices for audiences that they felt would have a high degree of impact after they had also rated them on those factors on the left. So we then combined the quantitative ratings and then sort of the more qualitative, just tell us what you think, rank the top 3. We got input from OAH Council, from the Education and Outreach Working Group, and the Oregon Ocean Policy Advisory Council, OPAC. And those numbers were then used to calculate which of these 8 audiences were most likely to be effective targets for communicating about OAH in Oregon. And big reveal, there we go. The most highly rated audiences are highlighted here. We've got tourism and hospitality industry, commercial fisheries / harvest industry, the port and county commissioners, and the seafood suppliers and related restaurants. So with this final list of target audiences, the focus then shifted toward developing messages that would demonstrate successful science communication about OAH within each of these groups. I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions on what I've discussed so far.
Nettie, I just want to do a shout out to Liz. Thank you so much for pulling up those direct web pages. We strongly encourage folks to go to the Six Americas web pages and dig around with them. We do also have a question about who were the survey respondents. Liz, you mean beyond the audiences that Nettie was talking about? Beyond the council, beyond OPAC?
Yeah, it sounded, I was a little unclear if it was just the council or if, like, who was providing feedback on those narrative profiles.
The profiles were drafted by myself and Nancy and then run past OAH Council. And then the final version of those got sent around with these specific survey questions to the entire council, the Education Outreach Working Group, which has some overlap there, and then the OPAC group as well.
I think it.
Sorry.
And just sorry, one quick clarification for folks to read. Leaf has just reminded us that the communication plan, we want to make sure that it's posted outside the OOST website. It would be on the OAH Council, not ODFW. Okay.
Oh,
And
thank
we
you.
have not physically turned this in yet to OOST. So I guess we're also just asking folks that are on this to keep it within the family for right now.
Thank you. All right, I'll move to the next section, but feel free to add additional questions and we'll get back to them. We're going to talk about the messages. So the selection of audiences led to the next phase of creating messages about OAH that would resonate with those audiences and lead to action, right? And this requires really careful selection of language that clearly can explain the scientific phenomena of OAH, as well as a bit of framing to ensure that that science content can be well received. Unfortunately, as we know, knowledge alone is not a sufficient catalyst toward action. People don't change their behavior unless they feel some personal or emotional connection to an effort most of the time. So usually knowledge alone is not enough. And you know what else is that they're not going to continue, even if they're inspired, they won't continue to take action if they feel that the effort is somehow futile. And so having an effective message has to be emotionally driven at some level, as well as rooted in science, and be able to spur hope for the future. And one of the best ways to highlight hope with this sometimes dreary topic is to share solutions particularly that do feel tangible and that tap into a community level effort, because this allows people to connect with other members of their community around these difficult climate change issues, but in a meaningful and active way that will inspire others to join them rather than leaving everyone feeling despair for the future. And that's why before launching into an explanation of the science of OAH, often the best practice in science communication suggests let's lead with a shared value. Let's use this shared value framework to capture the attention of our intended audience rather than hit them right up front with the science facts. And we know that there are a couple of values, they're evidence-based values that test really well across all Americans, including these two here, the value or concepts of protection and responsible management. And what you see on the screen here is some language describing these two values that were tested by a group called the Frameworks Institute. And so, for instance, the shared value of protection. This is captured by the sense that, hey, we have a duty to safeguard the well-being of people and places. This sentiment is a pretty near universal truth. It includes some feelings like those in the bullet points that, for instance, showing concern is the right thing to do, or, hey, let's take measures to reduce risks. A lot of people can really resonate with that. Likewise, on the right-hand side, this idea of responsible management described with the phrase, taking common sense steps today is in the interests of future generations. That's a sentiment, a commonly held value. It includes ideas that many people feel are true, like, hey, let's handle these problems before they get worse. Or, you know what, future generations really depend on the decisions that we make today. So both of these values, the protection and the responsible management, they're also reflected in the visualizations of the data coming out of the 6 Americas study. So we're going to look at those a little, again, briefly. They'll look similar, but they're different maps. The value of protection is really represented in this idea of what percent of adults who believe citizens should do more to address global warming. This in Oregon is up to about 70% in certain areas compared to 65% nationally. So that value of protection is relatively strong across the state. If we look at the value of responsible management, it's encompassed in one of the data points from 6 Americas looking at the percent of adults who think global warming will harm future generations. And here, I think we see residents of Multnomah County reaching up to 80%. The majority of the state is between 65 and 70%. National average as a sort of comparison is 71%. But by grounding our understanding of the demographics around geographic differences, we can begin to see there's a need for targeting our selected audiences with messages specifically tailored to their values and their life experiences. After you've connected to an audience through a shared value, now is the time to explain what is OAH. There are certainly lots of scientific technical documents that will explain this phenomena. Our approach here involved kind of a co-creation of messaging with members of the public. And that's because we wanted to ensure that the wording resonated with them. So in April of last year, visitors to Oregon Coast Aquarium were invited to participate in this message testing to help us craft these clear, concise explanations of the scientific phenomena of ocean acidification and hypoxia. So what we did as the aquarium visitors entered the Jellies Gallery, if you're familiar with the space there, Nancy or I would approach them. We were using a continuous random sampling protocol. We invited them to participate in a tabletop activity that was set up where they were, if they agreed to participate, they were presented with, there were 29 statements written out on cards. And those statements were all about OAH. They were all true, accurate, one-sentence pieces of the puzzle of OAH. These statements were pulled from existing scientifically sound sources, including Oregon's OAH Action Plan, the NOAA website, the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation. And after hearing a brief explanation of the terms ocean acidification and hypoxia, we then instructed participants to look at all the cards on the table and assemble their own explanation of OAH. And we said preferably in a way that a group of fourth graders with a short attention span could comprehend. So this was, we gamified it a little bit, made it into a little bit of a fun thing for them to strategize how they might communicate to that type of an audience based on their understanding that we had just provided them and these true, accurate statements that they could choose from. And what happened was we actually had a total of 30 different summaries that were developed. So there were a couple that didn't work at all. People weren't taking it seriously, but almost in every case, people really did the activity the way that we instructed them. Some of them did that individually. In some cases, it was sort of a group or a family effort. That didn't matter. Each one ended up with essentially a paragraph by assembling these different statements. And what we found in then looking carefully through the different versions that we got, we showed that every statement that was available on the table was utilized at least twice. We found that the average number of statements that people used to complete their paragraph was 7.5. The fewest, some people could do it in as little as 4. And there was one group that used 16, but on average, they were using between 7 and 8 sentences to get there. Interestingly, there was one most common phrase. It was used by 57% of respondents, and that was the one at the top. The term hypoxia refers to low or depleted oxygen in a body of water. That seemed an essential piece for everyone to understand it. And then there was also a least common phrase. Only 7% of people picked this one. It said, salmon, halibut, Dungeness crab, razor clams, oysters, pink shrimp, lamprey, and rockfish have helped generations of Oregonians earn a living. That one wasn't chosen very frequently. But notably, over a third of participants all selected the same 9 statements, which are shown here. These ones kept popping up. So together, we discovered that these most popular statements comprised a very sufficient explanation of ocean acidification and hypoxia, and could be delivered in less than 1 minute, and is easily comprehended by the majority of public audiences. So here is, ta-da, the core message that explains, in a way the general public understands, the scientific phenomenon of OAH. It says, Oregon's ocean is changing, and many species have already shown signs of distress. Just as humans need calcium to build their bones, sea creatures need calcium carbonate to build strong skeletons and shells. The ocean absorbs a lot of carbon dioxide, which is changing the ocean's chemistry and prevents the development of calcium carbonate. This is called ocean acidification. As a result of the changing chemistry, we are seeing sea creatures' skeletons and shells becoming thinner or more brittle. And furthermore, right, they had to talk about hypoxia too. They said climate change is also the cause of hypoxia, as warmer waters hold less oxygen. As the Pacific Ocean warms, its ability to hold a lot of oxygen declines. The term hypoxia, here it is, refers to low or depleted oxygen in a body of water. Because most organisms need oxygen to live, few organisms can survive in hypoxic conditions. Local actions will lead to a brighter future for the oceans, its species, and the communities that depend on them. Now, for the purpose of effectively communicating about OAH, you are 100% encouraged to use these messages verbatim. They are yours. If you find that you really must adjust some of the language or add more detailed science facts for your purpose, just know that that new text has not been tested by an audience in the way that we went through this process. In that case, I would advise you to try and retest your revised message for its effectiveness with your particular audience. I feel like I could make a pause here. There's some questions I think maybe in the chat. Nancy, anything that I should address now?
We were just getting some comments about some affirmations about good to see community-based kind of solutions to bump it up from individual actions. And then I was just about to reiterate, we had 30 different groups, am I correct, of families that participated in this messaging exercise.
Correct.
And as Nettie said, what was interesting to watch was it was often a family conversation going on around that, which is actually in my mind, a bit of a success also, because you're getting them to talk about it and they're trying to figure out together.
Yep. Liz, you've got your hand up.
Do you feel that this is very Oregon-based messaging, or do you think that this could be applied elsewhere based on the work you've been doing?
So we certainly wanted to make it Oregon-based for the purpose of this project. And in as much as the people coming through the aquarium are largely local, that's true. That said, I don't think it's so vastly different from what a different region might be able to sort of get to themselves. But again, like, we want to be true to the process of message testing and not stray from our protocol as far as how we get there. So I think if you just, that's sort of just a caveat, right? I think it is applicable and used with caution. Any other questions, or I'll go to the next section on solutions. Okay, so let's see, we delivered the core message. Now we want to end on some kind of a solutions-oriented action, either something that the audience can themselves really engage in, or something that might be occurring just in their community that they could support. Kind of regardless of how a group is oriented, this approach of linking the values back to, or linking values through the explanation to the solution, that helps put the direction of the conversation and the solutions back on the citizens themselves, so they can see that there's a role they can play. This approach to messaging actually has another benefit. As far as when we're talking specifically about Oregonians, we know that one of the attitudes that a lot of Oregonians carry is this a little bit of, less government. I'm a rugged individual. And so ending on a community level solution is actually very effective in that population. So let me show you how these three parts sort of stack up. Going back to, you want to start with that shared value. That's the statement that elicits kind of a feeling around protection or responsible management, gets their attention, gets them to see that, oh yes, I'm hearing you, that feels right to me, tell me more. That allows you to go into your core message, which is that 1-minute explanation of OAH. And then you're going to end with a community level solution that ties to the particular audience's interests and maybe even hints back at the value that you were leading off with. Let me show you what this looks like with each of our 4 target audiences. Starting with commercial fisheries and harvest industry. So leading with the value, we're going to hit them with the idea that, hey, we must protect Oregon's fishermen and shellfish harvesters from being harmed by the effects of OAH. That's that protection value. Then, and you're talking to people who have an affinity for this audience. So either they are themselves a member of that group, or maybe their livelihood is very much influenced by people they know in that area. So then you've got their attention. Yep, we must protect them. Now I'm going to tell you in a minute or less how OAH, the mechanism of it, how it works. Okay, so now we're kind of on the same page with that. And then I'm going to end with a focus that moves us towards a solution. Maybe something like, protecting our harvest industry means actively eliminating or reducing the risks of ocean acidification and hypoxia. You can go on to be really specific to say, here at such and such a fishery, we're actively eliminating, we're reducing risks of OAH by blah, 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 insert your solution. And then kind of, summarizing with this idea that we all need to be vigilant. We need to help shield and safeguard the habitats and the people that are affected by OAH. For a different audience, it's going to be very similar, but it takes just a slightly different angle. So when engaging with the local government officials, we're looking at Port and County commissioners, your message might sound something like this, telling them taking practical common sense steps to address OAH is in the best interest for future generations. So that's that responsible management value. You then explain the process, same core message as before, but then you're ending on a slightly different note as far as the solution, to just note that, hey, making step-by-step, really practical, feasible approaches allows us to make progress on these really long-standing challenges around OAH. You might say, here in such and such a county, we're making real progress by doing, and then insert your particular, project of the week. And note that we can all kind of make a difference. We got to handle these problems before they get worse, so that we're protecting those future generations. You sort of start to get the picture, right? You want to get the attention of the people who you're talking to. So here we have seafood suppliers and restaurants. Let's tap into their interests. We have to protect Oregon's beloved seafood restaurants from being harmed by the OAH, leading with the value that they're going to care about. Core message, insert, tell them how it works, and then land on the idea that showing concern for the welfare of seafood suppliers, it's the right thing to do. And maybe you tell them that here at such and such a restaurant, we are doing the right thing by supporting blah, blah, blah. And we want you to join us. We want you to help us protect and preserve the Oregon coast and these populations of fish that we all depend on. And finally, we'll put a little bit of a tourism and hospitality industry spin on it. We could say we all want to enjoy Oregon's beautiful coast today, for many tomorrows, and taking our practical common sense steps to address OAH, again, in the best interest for future generations. There's that shared value. Stick in the core message and end with future generations depend on the decisions and plans we make today. Here at such and such a hotel or such and such a tourist site, we're committing to future generations by doing this. And we appreciate your shared commitment, being responsible with our natural resources, ensuring that future generations can enjoy their visits to the Oregon coast. Pause for any reflections on how this is sounding.
We're good on the chat box. It must mean either everyone's really loving it or, okay, we've got a question about, okay, so we've got, sorry, I'm looking at Fran or Keith's questions. Fran had the question, what did people think the cause of Oregon's ocean is changing and climate change is the cause of hypoxia mean? What was explained to them, re climate change, while we were doing the exercise?
Oh, is that what you're asking? How did we
Yes.
explain OAH to them?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I can't remember exactly the language we gave them, but it was a very brief, high-level understanding. And then they read those 29 statements to better understand the complexity of the issue.
Okay, and then the next comment really was from Keith about a science response, including it, which I think you'll see that tomorrow when we talk about through the implementation. Yes, this is not the complete messaging. It's going to need to be customized. You're looking at things about the risk here, as Keith sees it, is the declarative nature of the statements, which don't capture all of the effects of OAH. And yes, it will not. It's a way to start a conversation.
Mm-hmm. Karina, I'll call on you with your hand up.
Thanks. Hey, yeah, I think, we've talked about this before. I think you'll remember, and Fran's questions kind of reflect some of the things that I've asked about this messaging before. As standalone messages, I'm not understanding, even in the second paragraph, you say, let's see, let me get back.
Do you want me to go back to it?
Yeah, it assumes that you've said the word climate change somewhere before, and it's not in the first paragraph. So it's confusing to me.
And you know what?
How you would use those verbatim as standalone messages.
Yeah, Karina, great question.
Yeah.
And what we've found is people didn't need those statements, right? That information was available to them in those 29 statement cards. And the majority of people were okay,
right,
using context clues, essentially. I mean, I think climate change.
So I agree. I understand in that context, but you're presenting these as standalone messages, and they won't have that context necessarily.
So
that's why I'm confused.
Yeah, and when you say standalone, are you imagining a context in which it's just sort of floating in space? I don't know why there wouldn't be a little bit of structure around, like, whatever your audience is, they've come for a purpose. I don't know exactly what scenario you're envisioning that maybe we can help figure out what you would need to say additionally.
Well, if I wasn't standing at a table or in an exhibit that had something about climate change. So in other words, you're imagining precursor conversation that would happen that would somehow set the stage for these messages. That's what I'm trying to understand.
I think what we had understood that often that the OAH Council and the people who would be implementing this work are going to be in settings where they've either been invited to talk on this topic or, right, there's some other
there is a context. They're not just
like you're not just running up to someone on the street. That I think would be odd. Yes, and that's not what this is intended to necessarily offer. Leaf, you've got your hand up.
Is it fair to think of these as effectively they're the topic sentence to a conversation you're having with someone? So they're kind of the thing that we start from, and then you would do it for our 4 different audiences. But this is kind of that core starting point that you would share across those different groups.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think of it.
Well,
But, I mean,
especially because you're saying not to modify them. That's why, this is why I'm asking you, because I'm
Yeah,
trying to
and
really
then-
understand what, how we would apply.
and we want this to be a useful tool for you, right? It's not helpful to us to have written this. It's something that needs to be taken forward by you all. And so what we're telling you with these versions is that they tested well, and therefore you should feel encouraged that they are an effective communication tool. Like I said, if you in the context of wherever you are maybe presenting, there could be a lot more that you talk about, or a specific species that you're focusing on even. And that's appropriate, as long as you have just that caveat, right? It's not been tested. We can't promise you that that your specific sentences are going to resonate. We tried to, using the audiences that this group identified as being a priority, wanted to come up with language that would really be useful for those contexts. And you may find yourself in a lot of other spaces as well.
Thanks for clarifying. I just, it's just been, we've been struggling with this a little bit, as you know, and I don't disagree with the frameworks that you're using, just so you know, like that more information is not what's going to be effective. So it's not coming from there. I just, thanks for.
Yeah, and I mean, you all have much more depth of knowledge and really interesting facts, I think, to add to these. Just use it with caution, right? If your audience responds well to the basic messaging, that is a sign that absolutely they want you to dive in more, and you should certainly do that then with them. What we're trying to prevent is if you come in hot and heavy with your deep science and it just sort of makes people glaze over. Now you've missed a chance to connect with them, and isn't that a shame? So just, I would say, start with the basics, and you can then get pretty easily get a read on whether they want to hear more and are interested in the more complex phenomena that you all can speak to. Jesse.
We also
Hello.
have Fran has her hand up also, just sorry, Nettie.
Oh, thank you.
Fran, you go ahead, and I also think if maybe Leaf, if you want to go first. I just have a comment, but Fran, over to you first.
Thank you. And I appreciate all the work that went into developing these, but I've raised this issue about climate change, CO2, if we're asking people to contact politicians or anything, there's got to be an explanation. So I'm just wondering, what sentences did you give people about climate change? What's the cause of climate change to choose from? And also I question, I mean, it was a great audience to go to the Oregon Coast Aquarium, but these are mostly people from out of state. And it might have been better to be on the docks or, downtown Newport, or, I think we would have gotten a bigger range of people,
I love that idea, Fran. I love that idea of going to those spaces. We were restricted in terms of our time and access for the one opportunity we had to be on site, but that would be a really interesting place to go and do the same thing. And if you're interested, any of you, the entire protocol and all the details of how we did this are in the appendix of that final document. And it includes, you'll see there also all of the 30 statements that were prepared and given as options. And
could you give me an example of one, please, that mentions carbon dioxide?
I don't have them memorized. I'm so sorry, Fran.
Fran, this is Leaf. I have it up. I can read you one.
Thank you.
The last one is, when we burn fossil fuels like coal and gas, we release carbon dioxide into the air.
And
that's the sentence. I mean, they're all discrete sentences. I just picked one that had carbon dioxide. That was the question. I mean, the ocean absorbs the extra carbon dioxide that gets emitted into the atmosphere when we burn fossil fuels, and that changes the chemistry of the ocean. There's a number of them. When carbon dioxide is added to the seawater, it makes the ocean more acidic. So I'm just glancing over at my other screen saying this. I'm not like picking those specifically. So
Okay, thank you.
Those have CO2 like you asked.
Thank you.
Thanks for your questions. I forget who we needed to go to next. Jesse.
Yeah, no, this is a good conversation. And I, for context, my name's Jessie with something called the Ocean Acidification Alliance. So we, and I think one of my colleagues actually is on the phone who is involved in our comms work as well. And we have been trying for several years to sort of reach out to different types of governments, both in the US and internationally, on how we are talking about this issue. And how we're inspiring different governments to take action specifically, although we've been trying to broaden that constituency a bit over the last couple of years. So all to say with that context, I mean, we've been watching with great anticipation this project move forward, and so grateful for Oregon's leadership on this specifically. I think I'm really intrigued by, I mean, I think the way to synthesize, or the way that OA as a definition, hypoxia, has been synthesized here is great. And I'm really intrigued by the two types of messaging. You know, we've really struggled with what's the call to action. You know, with governments, it's a very particular thing that we're asking them to do by way of integrating existing science or accelerating science that's needed across different types of policies. But even that requires an amount of like table setting and communication that needs to be built, a bridge between why we need that to happen. I'm really intrigued by the different constituencies that this group has selected. And I really I'm curious if Ned, if you might move forward to the three kind of, leading with the value, explaining. I really like that framework. And if you go forward one more, I'm just really intrigued by the message of, you know, things we can be doing now, but then also that we all have a stake. I mean, I really love, I'm curious by the way that, how is the discussion between we all have a stake versus it's the right thing to do? Because I think this is the first time I've really heard the it's the right thing to do message come through so strongly. And I think that we shy away from that sometimes with different audiences because we want to feel like it's too preachy, or, you know, something that we always want it to be like directly impacting the individual, and therefore that direct impact elicits a response, you know. And I think that some of the messaging I'm hearing here is just simply the appeal for it's the right thing to do in a different way. And I'm just really intrigued by that. And I'm curious if you could share a little bit more about those two. Yeah. How you wrestle with those two framing devices.
I think it's an interesting question, right? And I think I had the same sense when I first came across these. And this is all work. If you're interested in diving more deeply, go to the Frameworks Institute website. It explains this in greater detail and all the different ways that they tested these different values. And they continue to test, because we also know that, you know, something that was true before the pandemic, for instance, may not hold as strong a value anymore. And so that's really helpful in terms of understanding the full picture of how they reached this idea. And that, like you said, it's the right thing to do. Well, who are you to say that it is or not? Well, it turns out that largely as a population, we actually do share a lot in that space. And so we can build off of that and use that angle to get people to talk much more about these complex issues and be receptive to our messaging that we know we want to get to them, just by sort of sharing that, like, well, you know, it's the right thing. And so do we at such and such an organization are doing our part as well. And it really helps people to see where there is common ground. And I think also you were starting to foreshadow where we're going next, Jesse. We're going to talk about the sort of actions piece, right? Because you're like, well, it's one thing to get them, you know, intrigued in terms of sharing that value, but now we're looking at a solution, and where do we go from here? Where's that action? So we'll get there next. But if there might be one more question before then.
Nettie, I wanted to actually add in a little bit about when you do go to the Frameworks webpage to look at this, realize that their research into values has been evolving. They test them periodically. For instance, when I think when Nettie and I started working on this back in 2009, there was a value we thought really spoke to people, which was the value of innovation. Americans love to be innovative. We think that the solution could be, something out there. And what frameworks found was that was kind of counterproductive on getting people to climate change solutions or their own behavior, because it was, well, someone else, some mysterious other person will solve it. It's not up to me. So we've eliminated that value actually from climate change conversations.
That's right. Thank you. Well, let's talk about some actions. So this is the next section of that communication toolkit, looking at civic actions, because, as eloquent or effective as our messages might be, the messaging alone isn't going to fix OAH. After we've gotten people's attention and gotten them to really communicate with us clearly, we need to spur them to action. So you've reached your audience, you've got that clear, compelling message. Now you're going to engage them in some kind of a meaningful related action. As a spoiler alert, there isn't a silver bullet action. You all know that. But we do know also that addressing the human causes of OAH is going to take people, a lot of different people taking action at many different levels. So while there is no single action that everyone can take or will take, different audiences have varying capacities to make a difference. So moving people towards action, once that message has been conveyed, some examples here that are tied to the messages and that can be encouraged for each target audience are shown here. So for instance, for local government officials, encouraging them to sort of keep talking about this, increase the community conversations and understandings when you have the opportunity at your public meetings, when you go to a trade association presentation, you're doing some kind of a training workshop, you're talking to the media. These are all places that they can do their part to address OAH. Similarly, seafood suppliers and restaurants have opportunities within their industries to reduce the carbon footprint that they may have and directly impact OAH. Commercial fisheries, harvest industry people, they can get active by following their legislative discussions, looking at things around coastal permitting, environmental reviews, things that are meaningful to them in their space. And lastly, with the tourism folks, focusing on what are the economic indicators that track OAH for a specific business that they're involved in. So I will end on kind of the last piece that shows up in the communication toolkit, which is the resources section. We all know that most of the users of this toolkit are, like you, very well versed in the science behind OAH. So this resources section doesn't offer you maybe anything new, but it's not an exhaustive list, right? There's a number of articles, but not all of them. And what we've tried to do is highlight a few really well-crafted resources that are accessible to anyone, kind of a sampling of materials, good to use as a refresher for anyone who is wishing to communicate effectively or sharing maybe ideas and articles with audiences who are still learning. And as I mentioned, there's even more resources in the appendix, which also includes the additional background on all of the processes we followed to develop the toolkit. So, any last questions on part one?
Nettie, we did have a very good question from Karina about, how can these conversations help us when you may be in a polarizing situation? For instance, offshore wind is controversial for many in Oregon.
So zoom out as far as you need to when you're finding yourself in conflict and this conversation isn't going to be productive. Just take a step back. Where do we still have common ground? Not there yet. Okay, take a little further step back. Zoom out to whatever level of that shared common ground that you have. We both want to, preserve this space for future generations, might be where you have your common ground. And then do a lot more listening. Allow whoever is being contentious about it to get their ideas out there. and then remind them, hey, we're in this together, shared common ground, and maybe that will help. It's not always going to work perfectly smoothly. Nancy and I have, of course, stumbled through many similar challenging conversations, but there are ways to sort of pivot to the conversation is going to be productive. And just practicing it, right? We all make mistakes in these conversations and end up getting too emotionally fueled about it and going away shaking our fists. And so you give it another try another day. That's my advice.
I think also the other point would be, by winnowing down the audiences to the ones that through this process we've identified, these should be people that are somehow already there in some way. So it may not be starting at ground zero with them. There will be commonalities. And as Nettie's gone through, touch on a value, pique their interest with these, the statements, and then listen to them.
Go ahead, Jesse.
Just diving deeper a little bit on that question of messaging around ocean acidification and hypoxia interacting with other more controversial mitigation strategies. I think that's something that we've come into contact with a lot. So in this case, offshore wind, but in other cases, marine carbon dioxide removal has been a more active conversation I'm sure many of you online are familiar with. And just adding, I guess, our little thoughts and kind of we're starting to have these conversations ourselves, and curious other folks on the line from NOAA or otherwise that have perspectives on this. I think it's not necessarily our instinct that communicating that we need to be taking action now on ocean acidification automatically leads to, and therefore you must do all of these things. In this case, in marine carbon dioxide removal, it's not a endorsement, across the board to move forward. It's that because of ocean acidification, we need to be exploring the benefits and the risks of different mitigation and adaptation strategies now. And so I think, it's not to necessarily misuse ocean acidification as a number one endorsement of any of these different mitigation options that might be more controversial, but it's not to shy away from the fact that we need to be having these conversations in the context of a changing climate, in the context of ocean acidification. So I don't know, Karina, if that's more along the lines of what you're thinking about, that it's not necessarily leads to, a requirement that then one embraces every mitigation kind of option on the table, but it's an entry point to discuss what the costs and benefits would be. I don't know if if other people have thoughts on that kind of relationship.
Yeah, I mean,
go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, it's just an interesting time to be talking, given that these strategies are coming, or mitigation approaches are being, in the public mind and in conversation, and there's a lot of conflict around them. And so when we're trying to connect things to possible solutions or possible mitigations, you're starting at a point where people have very strong emotions already, and feelings and concerns, many of them valid. So anyway, it's just an interesting space to navigate right now, particularly. So I was just curious how people are approaching it or what ideas they have. So I appreciate your thoughts. Thanks, Jesse.
Yes, very appreciated. And you all should continue to use each other as a communications network, right? You all bump up against all kinds of interesting challenges in your work. And hopefully now that you've sort of shared this general strategy, you can tap into each other and say, hey, how are you doing this? Or this happened to me and it really went sideways. What did I do wrong? I encourage you to sort of lean on each other as you go forward. And that kind of touches on what we'll get into. This is a preview for tomorrow. We're going to follow along in the implementation plan to see kind of what does this look like in practice. As a reminder, recordings of both this session and tomorrow's session will be posted on the OOST website, so you have those for future reference. But really just want to thank you for joining us today. Hope we see you tomorrow as well. Any final questions or thoughts?